All right, well, welcome. Welcome from the Wayland Library in Wayland, Massachusetts. I'm Courtney from the library. Tonight we are excited to have Professor Melissa Kravetz here with us to share the memoir of Ilse Seger, Wife, Mother, Hostage, Nazi Resister. Before I introduce Professor Kravetz, I want to thank our co-sponsors, My Antifa and the Wayland Human Rights Diversity and Equity Committee for their support. And I also want to thank our partner libraries in Athol, Bedford, Clinton, Hanover, Holliston, Maynard, Needham, Rockland, Stowe, Tewksbury, and Wilbraham, Massachusetts. Melissa Kravetz is a professor of history and co-director of the Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Longwood University. She also teaches at the Alexander Liebenstein Teacher Education Institute at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. She's the author of Women Doctors in Weimar and Nazi Germany, Maternalism, Eugenics, and Professional Identity. Thank you so much to Dr. Kravetz for being here. I have two housekeeping notes. First, we are recording this program and we will post it to the Wayland Library YouTube page in the coming week, and I will email everyone when that's posted. And Professor Kravetz will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature rather than the chat, please. But do that anytime, and we'll try to get to them when we get to the Q&A. Now I'll hand it over to Professor Kravetz.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the Wayland Library and their co-sponsors for hosting me, and especially to Courtney and Michael for organizing this event and advertising it so well. And also thank you to all of you for joining. I feel very privileged to be able to publish this memoir and to talk to you today about this memoir at a very important historical moment. And I want to tell you a little bit, first of all, about how this memoir even landed in my lap. And I like to tell people in many ways that it did very much land in my lap at a very opportune time. So I'm going to try and move my slides forward. Here, hopefully you should see the first slide. So this is me teaching at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. So this is something that I've been doing for 10 years. In the summer, I teach K through 12 teachers. Here I am teaching, and our most recent class from last summer is here. So this memoir actually landed in my lap because of my work at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. So Charlie Sidnor, who is the former director of the museum and former historian of the museum, started talking to me about this memoir in 2017. He said, I think that the family really wants to see it published, and it might be really nice for you to publish this. And he is the one who put me in contact with Ilse's husband, Richard Brandt, who I'll talk to you about, and also her father-in-law. And they were the ones, or I guess it was Ilse's daughter's family, Renate's, we'll talk about Renate, but her daughter's family, Richard Brandt, and they started putting me in touch with them in 2017. And I took a trip to Indiana, where their family archive was located. And this is a family archive that was located in the back of a retirement community where Ilse's Ilse's daughter and Ilse's daughter's husband were living. This is in Terre Haute, Indiana. They were living there, and this was an archive that was in the back of plastic bins in the back of this retirement community. And when I received the memoir was actually in a single notepad file. So I don't know the last time any of you have used Notepad, but this was in a single notepad file. So it didn't appear in perfect form. And then the family said, why don't you fly to Indiana and check out our family archive? And I went there in August 2018. I was very pregnant at the time, and I combed through the plastic bins and brought a bunch of it home, and they sent a bunch of it with me. And now it is actually sitting in my hallway closet. And this is what this looks like. I actually had my department buy me some archival storage boxes. And I, of course, have thought seriously and actually given presentations on the ethical implications of having this family's treasure trove of materials in my personal possession. And I'm really trying to work with the family to try to get them to donate them to a museum. Also, every time I open the materials, usually on my guest bed, because that's really where I have room to do it, there are newspapers, and these newspapers here of speaking tour that Ilse's husband gave in 1934 and 35. And the materials are really kind of falling apart. So of course, this is something that you want to think seriously about when you're housing an archive, so to say. So I got the memoir, it was in this notepad file, and I spent the next 3 years editing the memoir. So I added an introduction to it. I added a lot of historical context, especially into chapter intros and conclusions. So I divided the memoir, so to say, into these chapters, and I also put in intros and conclusions, and then wrote a book proposal and received a book contract from Indiana University Press in June of 2022. And after peer reviews and copy edits and page proofs, the book was finally published December 3rd, 2024. So publishing also takes a very long time. So today I want to share the story of Ilse's life and maybe also give you some insight into how she became a resistor to dictatorship and some of the lessons perhaps that we can learn from her story. Here's Ilse with her family. Her name is Elisabeth, but her family always called her Ilse. So she was born in Strasbourg, which belonged to Germany at the time. She was born in 1903. So she had parents, they're pictured here, Ernst and Margaret Hart. They were both actors, which meant that her family moved around a lot. And Ilse was the eldest of three. She had two younger brothers, Joachim and Wolfgang, who she often did caregiving for. And here they are all pictured after Ilse and Gerhart's wedding. So Ilse was living in Freiburg, Germany, in southern Germany, where her family settled after the First World War, when a man by the name of Gerhart Heinrich Seger came to give a lecture there in 1928. So at the time, Gerhart Seger, who would eventually become her husband, was part of what is known as the Deutsche Friedensgesellschaft, which was a German peace organization. This organization had started back in 1892, and he often toured Germany. And so he was touring Freiburg, giving a lecture there, and Ilse and Gerhart met through friends. And they were engaged and married quickly. And in the first chapters of her memoir, Ilse writes a lot about what it's like to meet Gerhart, get married to him. And they have a daughter pretty quickly, Renate, who is pictured on the front of the memoir here. This is what this looks like, and you saw the images. So in 1930, Gerhart was a journalist, and he had been working for this German peace organization, and he decided to run for a seat in the German Reichstag as a member of the Social Democratic Party for the city of Magdeburg. And here's Ilse and Gerhart just after their marriage. So a lot of what she's writing about initially is them meeting, but very quickly she turns to the fact that he's going to be campaigning for a Reichstag position. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the Social Democratic Party of Germany, just because it is perhaps something that some of you are not familiar with. So this is a party that had been founded way back in 1863. It's a party that had traditionally always been made up of working class leftists. And it had always been a very popular party in German federal elections. And in fact, it became the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's Congress, in 1912. The Social Democratic Party also played a very pivotal role in the creation of what is known as the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, in 1919. And throughout the 1920s, it was consistently the largest party in the Reichstag. And in fact, the first president of the Weimar Republic is pictured here, Friedrich Ebert. He served as the first president of the Weimar Republic from 1919 until 1925. This party was a party that throughout the 1920s was very devoted to parliamentary liberal democracy. And they were leading Germany's first democracy Germany's first democracy throughout the 1920s. And they were finding coalitions with other political parties at the time. They were also consistently opposed to two new political parties that emerged after the First World War. So these two political parties were the Communists, which was also a new political party on the left. The Social Democrats were on the left as well. And also they were opposed to the Nazis, which is a new party that's going to emerge on the right. So the Nazi Party is a party that perhaps some of you are maybe more familiar with, but this is a party that emerges again in 1919, right in the aftermath of the First World War. The Nazi Party was attracting workers, and it was also attracting veterans. And some of the things that the Nazi Party embraced were extreme nationalism and racism, especially anti-Semitism, so hatred of Jews. They also favored nationalism and expansion to go along with that nationalism. And they also wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic. They were very adamant about doing this. And of course, the Weimar Republic was led by the Social Democrats. In addition to that, they also hated the communists, and they were very open about this from the very beginning. So Adolf Hitler joined the party in 1919 when he settled in Munich after the First World War, and he became the party's most talented speaker probably the party's chairman by about 1921. So let's move back to the September 1930 election. So just trying to point out to you that we have this party on the right, the National Socialists, and then we have these two political parties on the left, the Communists and the Social Democrats. And all the parties basically hate one another. So the September 1930 elections, this is the election that Gerhart Seger is running for office for the first time that Ilse is writing about. He's running as a member of the Social Democrats. And this was an election that was very much dominated by the Great Depression's effects on German unemployment. So the election happens about 11 months after that stock market crash. And the election was actually called early because unemployment numbers were continuing to rise. So you see on the slide here that unemployment was at about 2.2 million in March of 1930 when this election is called. So the reason that this election was able to be called early is because in the Weimar Constitution, the Germans had written into their constitution a clause that would allow the president of the Weimar Republic to declare a temporary dictatorship in the case of an emergency. And this is Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. This is something that President Paul von Hindenburg, who is the second president of the Weimar Republic, is going to use dozens of times. The reason that he uses it in this instance, declares an emergency, is the Depression and the very high unemployment numbers in 1930. So he declares an emergency, he calls an election, and this is again a time in which there are 15 political parties in the Reichstag. So it's very different than the United States with, it's two political parties. This is a time in which the Reichstag is very stagnated, and it's very difficult for them to be passing any legislation to deal with this economic crisis caused by the Depression. Unemployment numbers are rising. You can see there by March of 1932, unemployment will be at about 6 million. This is a third of the German working age population. So this 1930 election is a very pivotal election for the Nazis. This is an election in which people started to seek alternatives to the Social Democrats, who were again running the Weimar Republic. So the Nazi Party won 107 seats in this election out of 577. And at the time, they became the second largest party in the Reichstag. And this is an improvement from the 12 seats that they had in the Reichstag in 1928. But the communists also won a number of seats in this election. They won 77 seats. And Gerhart Seger also won a seat in the Reichstag for the first time. And he was again in the party that had been running the Weimar Republic for most of the 1920s. So President Paul von Hindenburg faces re-election in 1932, April of 1932, and he runs for president again. He wins, he beats Hitler. Hitler won 30% of the vote. And then In 1932, after he wins the presidency, Paul von Hindenburg calls two more elections that happen in July and November. And again, the whole point of these elections is similar to this election, is trying to create a majority in the Reichstag in order to pass legislation to deal with the mounting unemployment. So a lot of what Ilse is writing about in the first chapters of his book, in addition to their courtship, their marriage, the birth of their first child, is also this constant cycle of dissolving the Reichstag, campaigning, and new elections. And this is very much affecting her life. It's affecting her husband's life, because he has to rerun for office 3 different times between 1930 and 1932. And then he'll do it again in 1933, which I'll address in a moment here. She also starts to address the stronger presence of the Nazi Party in Germany in the years right before Hitler becomes chancellor, and the growing tensions in particular between the Nazi Party and the Social Democratic Party. So the Nazi Party famously had a paramilitary organization, a private army. These were known as the brown shirts colloquially, or the stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, but they were known as the brown shirts because of the brown shirts they wore. What probably some people don't know is that there was also a paramilitary organization that became the de facto paramilitary organization for the Social Democrats. This was known as the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, for the colors black, red, and gold. So these two paramilitary organizations, again, are voluntary groups of private army. A lot of what they would do is intimidate each other in the streets. They would beat each other up. And there's kind of open violence that's breaking out between these groups. But it's primarily taking place at political rallies or at assemblies. And so because Gerhart and Ilse are often at these political rallies and assemblies, they're very much in the mix of it. And some of this violence is even targeted at Ilse and her family. So again, Gerhart was constantly running for re-election during these cycles of dissolving the Reichstag and having campaigns over and over again. So the Nazi Party continues to win seats. They win more seats in the July 1932 election. They lose some seats in the November 1932 election. But with the Nazi Party winning more and more seats, President Paul von Hindenburg, who's pictured here, decides to appoint Hitler chancellor at the beginning of 1933. He does this because Hitler is deemed kind of the only acceptable option. He's definitively not a communist. The Germans were very afraid of communism coming to power in Germany. He was someone who had he doesn't have a majority in the Reichstag, but he has a large portion of the Reichstag with the Nazi Party. And there's the thought that he'll be able to pass legislation to deal with the mounting unemployment problem. So after Hitler is appointed chancellor, he immediately calls another election. The reason he does this is because he wants to gain a majority in the Reichstag. So about a week before that election, which is scheduled for March 5th, a fire breaks out in the Reichstag building. So the Reichstag is both the Congress, or the legislative body of Germany, but it's also there's a physical building where members meet. So to this day, it's unclear who set this fire. In fact, historians still debate who set this fire. Hitler, though, immediately blames the communists for starting this fire. And he asked the president to sign another emergency decree. And again, this is something that he had the ability to do because it was written into the Weimar Constitution. So the emergency decree, known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, is a decree that is making the president a dictator, but it's also passing some laws that, again, there's this pretense that there's a purported communist uprising. And this Reichstag Fire Decree also suspends people's civil liberties and also allows the police to arrest and detain people, anyone really that they saw fit. So what happens right after this, and this is again in the lead up to the election, which is supposed to be March 5th, there are hundreds of communists and social democrats that are arrested in the days and the weeks after the fire. So Ilse writes about the fire. She writes about how Gerhart's friends and colleagues tried to persuade him to leave the country or to go into hiding, because all of these members of the Reichstag who are communists and social democrats are getting arrested. So the March election goes on as scheduled, March 5th, and Gerhart wins his seat. But a lot of, again, the communists and social democrats who were running for re-election had also already been arrested. Some of them still won their seats. So Gerhart won his seat, and then he actually went to Leipzig. They were living in Dessau. I'll show you a map of where that is in a few slides. So he actually goes to Leipzig. This is kind of his way of going a little bit into hiding. He's not really hiding, he's just leaving his hometown. And he gets arrested a week after he wins his seat. Ilse writes about how stunned she is to learn about the fact that he's arrested, especially because he had tried to go into hiding in Leipzig a little bit. And he's also arrested really for no reason whatsoever, for the fact that he's a political opponent. So he gets put into a prison in Dessau for 3 months. And she actually writes about how she has the ability to visit him every other day for about an hour. She brings him writing materials. She brings him newspapers. But she's also stunned when she sees, for example, that his head has been shaved. Gerhart in June is then transferred to Oranienburg. Oranienburg is one of the first concentration camps that opens in June of 1933. So Oranienburg is located in a suburb of Berlin. You can actually reach it on the S-Bahn line. I'm taking students to Berlin in just 2 months, and I'll take them to Oranienburg. So there's a much more famous concentration camp in Oranienburg that opens after this one closes, known as Sachsenhausen. So Sachsenhausen is located in Oranienburg. So he's transferred to Oranienburg, and he spends 6 months there. And Ilse gives us a lot of insight in her memoir about what it's like to try to visit someone in an early concentration camp. So the visiting hours are very arbitrary. Sometimes there would be lengthy bans on visitors, and visits would, of course, be very closely monitored. So she's able to visit him about every 2 weeks, but again, sometimes this is kind of arbitrary. Meanwhile, she's also living in Dessau, and you can't see Dessau on this map. I'll show you a future map where you can see it. And she's also witnessing some of the other things that are happening in her country, which she loves very much, in the early months of 1933. So some of the things that happen is April 1st of 1933, Hitler organizes a boycott of Jewish businesses and stores. So this is supposed to be a one-day boycott. It's meant to sort of isolate Jews from society, so much so that they would want to voluntarily leave Germany. Ilse writes about how on this day of the boycott, she did not need to buy anything, but she decided to go to a Jewish-owned department store. There were SA guards standing out in front, and she walked in and bought a curtain rod that she did not need. And she talks a lot about how she felt like she wanted to be in solidarity with these ladies who she knew, and she was one of the only people in the department store. And I'll talk about this kind of at the end about how this is very much obviously a moment of resistance for Ilse. She also talks about the book burning that happens. So this is a book burning that Joseph Goebbels organizes with students. The most famous one is at the Humboldt University in Berlin, but there's also book burnings that happen all over Germany. So her memoir is kind of offering us a very rare look into kind of everyday life for citizens, how they're perceiving early arrests, how they're perceiving violence, how they're perceiving anti-Semitism. Ilse also discusses then how Gerhart escapes from Oranienburg. So 6 months in December of 1933, she goes to visit him one last time. She smuggles some money into the camp for him, very much an act of resistance. And then she doesn't know what happens to him. We know a lot about what happens to him because after he escaped, he wrote his own book, Oranienburg, which is then translated into several languages. You can read it in English. It's called A Nation Terrorized. So he claims in this account, in particular, that he felt as if in December of 1933, his only choices were to escape or suicide. So he actually managed to escape to Czechoslovakia with the help of an underground network of social democrats and with the help of people like his wife, who smuggled money into the camp for him. He also managed to escape because in an early concentration camp like Oranienburg, they really lacked the infrastructure of later camps. They're known, in fact, as wild camps. The Nazis were creating camps in whatever spaces were available to them. So Oranienburg lacked barbed wire, it lacked barracks, it didn't have guard towers, and Gerhart was not completely isolated from society. When he was working outside the camp, he was often very close to towns. He also didn't have to wear a prison uniform. He was wearing his own clothes, which meant that escaping was easier. So very early one morning, as he was performing hard labor, he used an embankment that they had created from their work as cover, and he ran along the embankment and then through an open field. And the SA guards, the other prisoners, did not notice him, and he made his way to a restaurant in the town that he was nearby, where he called a taxi. And he was able to pay for this taxi because Ilse had smuggled this money in. So he traveled via taxi, and tram, and streetcar to Berlin, through Berlin. He even stopped at a bathhouse for the first warm bath in about 9 months. He talks about how he stayed away from the center of town, and he used local trains and buses. And then he gets to the border of Czechoslovakia. I'll show you here, where Oranienburg is, where the border of Czechoslovakia is, and he then walked through the mountains over the border to Prague in below freezing weather. So the whole trip, the whole escape, took him 22 hours. This is the map where you can also see where Dessau is. So Ilse saw Gerhart. She goes back to Dessau, and two men almost immediately visit her home, and they inform her that her husband has escaped. And she had no idea that this had happened. She discussed, of course, the uncertainty of this time, not knowing whether or not he had been caught. The guards say that they're going to have to stay there at her house. And her daughter is about 1.25 years at this point. And she has no information about whether or not he had survived. And for 3 days, she's under house arrest. So she has 2 sets of guards who come to her house in 12-hour shifts. On the 4th day of her house arrest, her mother-in-law shows up, and she actually concocts a plan to talk to her secretly away from the guards in order to learn that Gerhart has survived and that he's in Prague, where there was an underground network of social democrats who were living in exile. Ilse and her daughter then had to remain in house arrest because, of course, the guards had not found out about his arrest. And she discussed in her memoir about this invasion of her private household and how that made her feel. So the police finally get word that Gerhart made it back to Prague, and Ilse learned this news, again, first from her mother-in-law. And so she's no longer under house arrest. She can just live in her apartment. She actually debated escaping to Prague at one point herself, because of the fact that she really wanted to see her husband again, but she was, of course, deciding between putting her family, her friends, herself, her daughter in danger, or never seeing her husband again. So she's let out of house arrest, but shortly after, the police commissioner of Dessau shows up at her house and tells her that she's actually going to need to be detained in Rosslau, which is a new concentration camp that has just opened near Dessau, her hometown. The police commissioner tells her that she needs to move there for safety concerns. But it becomes pretty clear that once she's there and she is forced to move there with her daughter, who's only a year and a half old. But the whole reason for her being in this concentration camp is to entice Gerhart back to Germany. So she is a hostage. She became a hostage alongside her daughter. So Ilse gives us a very detailed description of Rosslau. And Rosslau is not a concentration camp that we know a lot about at all. In fact, you can find very few pictures of Rosslau. Rosslau is not open for very long. It's one of these early wild camps. A lot of what she tells us in her memoir is about the fluctuation of prisoners in Rosslau. Some are only staying a few days. Some are discharged after a short stay. And this is kind of typical of these early camps where you have a cycle of arrests. We know that at least 40 of the prisoners had been transferred from Oranienburg, and they actually knew Gerhart when he was there. She never encountered any Jews in the camps. All the prisoners were either social democrats or communists. These were the first prisoners in concentration camps, the political enemies of the Nazis. We also get a sense of how her life differed from other prisoners. So Ilse had certain privileges in Rosslau that other prisoners didn't. And she may have been permitted some of these liberties because of her status as a hostage rather than a prisoner. She may have been permitted some privileges because of the fact that she was a woman. She and her daughter were the only women in the concentration camps. So for example, she demanded that her daughter's crib be brought to Rosslau. And the Dessau police chief actually accommodated this request. So this is not a small task for the police, and it likely appeared very out of place at a concentration camp. She was also allowed to ask for whatever she needed for Renate, her daughter, in terms of food items. She would pay for them herself. She was able to use the commandant's private toilet. And one privilege she enjoyed almost daily was the ability to go out into the garden or to go out of the camp on outings. Of course, she would always be accompanied by a guard, but she would go to the park, to library, to stores, just on a walk through town. She was not, in other words, performing forced labor like other prisoners. And again, this is likely due to her status as a hostage. One of the people she befriended on these excursions was an SS officer who she learned only joined because he needed work. He only joined the SS because he needed work. And she very much talks about how she was treated kindly by him, and she was also treated kindly by the people of Rosslau. So when she first arrived there, people showed up to welcome her to the camp, even though it was supposed to be a secret that she was going there. They also would leave things in her daughter's stroller when she was out walking through town. They would leave small gifts for her. And she very much identifies that this is a moment of them showing sympathy with her. So Ilse and Renate spent 4 months in Rosslau before they were unexpectedly released. And this all came about because of Gerhart's transnational connections through the Social Democrats and also through the German Peace Society that he had been working in the 1920s. Remember that he had written that book about Oranienburg in 1934 when he was living in exile in Prague. So that book was published right away. It was translated into several languages, and he was invited to give talks all around Europe. So one of the places that he went to give talks was for Parliament in England. And when he was giving his talk in Parliament, he got in contact with some members of Parliament who helped him facilitate Ilse and Renate's release. They put a lot of pressure on the German ambassador to the United Kingdom to demand the release of Ilse and Renate. Keep in mind that this is a time in which the Nazis were angling to create allies around the continent. And one of the allies that they were trying to create an Anglo-German partnership. So they were very concerned about English public opinion. So the members of Parliament recognized that the Nazis wanted to avoid this negative public attention. And so this really influenced the individual release of Ilse and Renate. So Ilse receives a visit once she's out of the concentration camp from some of these members of Parliament back in Dessau. And she has to make the decision to leave Dessau for Berlin and then leave the country right away. And this is a woman who deeply loves her country. And she has to leave without calling her parents, without telling her parents or her family. She actually has to say goodbye to one of her best friends, not knowing if she would ever see her again. And she just really loves Germany, and she doesn't necessarily want to leave Germany, even after she's been imprisoned. So Ilse and Renate do leave Germany, and they are reunited with Gerhart in London on May 26, 1934. So this is about a week after she's released from Rosslau. And this is a big press event, likely, again, because of the uniqueness of their story. They then go and spend some time in Norway, where Gerhart was giving a tour of his book. And then he tells her that he's been invited to the United States. And so they have to plan for a place for them to live in exile while he's going to go to the United States. And he comes to the United States for about 8 months between 1934 and 1935. So she's once again on her own, raising her daughter. And they decide that her and her daughter are going to live in exile, initially on the coast of France, and then eventually in St. Gallen, Switzerland. All the while that Renate and Ilse are living in exile, and some of the times that Gerhart is there with them, he's with them in France when they're in exile, and then he goes away, he comes back, and then he goes away again because he's going to emigrate permanently to the US, but they have to wait for their visas. All the while, they're also witnessing from abroad the things going on in Germany. So for example, there's a big plebiscite that happens in January of 1935, in which members of a region of Germany, the Saar region, have to decide whether or not they want to remain independent or go back into German hands. They also talk about how they're living in Paris, or they're in Paris briefly in 1934 in June during the Night of Long Knives, a very famous purge, the SA purge of the SS purge of the SA, two paramilitary organizations that were sort of competing with one another. And all the while they're living in exile, Ilse and Gerhart are very hopeful that the German military or the German people would stand up against Hitler. And this was not the case in either of these instances. So while she's living in exile, her husband is in the United States, and then he permanently immigrates to the United States. He gets a job in New York. She spends a lot of time learning English herself in anticipation of moving to America, and she gets visits from her family and friends. And then they make arrangements for her visa and move. And so she's able to be reunited with Gerhart in New York in December of 1935. Gerhart, and that's kind of where the memoir ends, but Mark Brandt, who is Ilse's oldest grandson, has written an epilogue. So I just want to tell you a little bit about what happens to her once she moves to the United States. So Gerhart was working as an editor for a German language newspaper in New York, and he also gave lectures and became a consultant for the US government. Renate, their daughter, grew up in New York City, and she married Richard Brandt, who was the man that I was first put in touch with. They met at Queens College, where they were both students, and they were initially employed in New York. And then Richard, her husband, went on to get a master's in chemistry and a PhD in biochemistry. And they had 3 grandchildren between 1960 and 1965, Mark, Jennifer, and Andrew. So Mark, I met back in 2018 because he's living close to his parents in Terre Haute, Indiana. And Jennifer, I actually had the privilege of meeting just 2 weeks ago. I traveled to where she works as an artist, and I gave a talk at her workspace. So it was a very special moment for me to meet Ilse's granddaughter just a couple weeks ago. And here we are doing an art class as well. So after they have these children, in 1967, Gerhart died. And a couple years later, Richard, Ilse's son-in-law, got a job at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond, which is how they ended up in Richmond, Virginia. So Ilse was left behind in New York without her family. She was already depressed after her husband's death. So Renate, her daughter, encouraged her to write this memoir as a way to help Ilse with the loss and dislocation. So she wrote this memoir in 1970. She moved to Richmond in 1979 and died. She moved in 1978 and she died in 1979 at the age of 76. Richard Brandt ended up working for 27 years for the Medical College of Virginia, and Renate worked as a school librarian here. And again, I got to meet both of them in 2016 when I went to Indiana. They were very advanced in age at that time. Renate died in 2020 and Richard died in 2021. And I also got to meet Mark at that time, and then of course met Jennifer a couple weeks ago. So to finish out here, I just want to say that although I have always told people that this memoir fell into my lap at the right time, I also like to think that I took a lot of agency in highlighting certain parts of Ilse's identity. And one of the main ways that I took a lot of agency was speaking to Ilse's identity as a resistor. This is an argument I make throughout the book. Had Ilse been asked herself if she was a resistor, I'm not quite sure how she would have responded. There is certainly a moment in the book where she talks about what she was doing was resistance, but I do think that because of the circumstances and the context of the time, she might have been so scared to be so honest about being a resistor. She certainly never expected her husband to get arrested simply because of his political views. She certainly never expected for her and her 18-month-old daughter to be put into a concentration camp just to goad him back to Germany. So I do want to talk about some of the ways, some of the things that she can teach us kind of for the present moment. So she recognized at times that the simple act of discussing the new Nazi regime with other political opponents together in their homes at a point where they knew they could get in trouble, they would keep cards out and keep coffee and tea out just in case someone showed up. So this idea of resisting in their everyday lives, in their domestic lives, engaging in civil discourse is very much a core tenet of a democratic society. It's one way to resist dictatorship. This is something that Ilse very much participates in. Ilse also never obeys in advance. The great historian Tim Snyder, in his book On Tyranny, which was first published in 2017, reminds us never to obey in advance. And Ilse never does this. She very easily could have, but she doesn't do anything. And she, in fact, is constantly concocting plans to talk with her mother-in-law or concocting a plan to smuggle money into the concentration camp before she's actually put into a concentration camp herself. Ilse also chooses to resist economically. On that day, on April 1st, 1933, that Hitler had called a boycott of Jewish-owned shops and businesses. She purposefully walked into that Jewish-owned department store and bought something she didn't need. So economic resistance is very important. We should never underestimate the power of where and how we can spend and donate our money if we're fortunate enough to have the means. This was an unpopular choice at the time. She showed solidarity with Jews, which would, of course, be the main group of people who were being persecuted. This is something that we should also all keep in mind. She recognized the great risk that people took by leaving her small gifts when she was out walking in Rosslau, by people coming to visit her when she first showed up at the camp. And she also demonstrates solidarity and sympathy with those who are persecuted, the Jews. So she has sympathy shown to her. She also shows sympathy with others and solidarity with others. And this is important to remember because you never know when you could become the persecuted group. So Ilse's resistance very much shows us a broad definition of resistance, something that includes passive acts of resistance, domestic, everyday acts of resistance, Many of Ilse's actions were very much antithetical to what the Nazis were trying to do. They were trying to create a culture of isolation, a culture of denunciation. So gathering with friends to discuss verboten topics is certainly undermining the Nazi strategy to try to isolate this people. So I just want to say that Ilse has very much been an inspiration to me, and hopefully she will be to all of you. She gives me a lot of hope about what ordinary people did and will do in the face of rising authoritarianism. People did and can subtly resist in their everyday lives. I hope we all remember this in the coming months, and I wanted to thank you and thank the Wayland Library and Courtney Michael again for hosting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa, or Professor Kravetz. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, and maybe I'll start with a couple that relate to what you just finished talking about. Someone is asking, what do you mean by obey in advance? What would be an example of that?
So in the Nazi time, of course, a lot is happening, where Ilse could have, of course, turned herself in. She was being used as a hostage. She didn't know this initially, but she could have turned herself in to Nazi authorities. So I think in the current moment, thinking about some of the kind of obedience that we see, I work at a university, but we see universities kind of showing, especially to executive orders about DEI policies and things like that. Again, there's no legality behind these things. And a lot of universities are sort of shutting down DEI offices as an example. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of an example in the current moment and the past moment.
Thank you. What did she mean by saying that engaging in civil discourse is one way to resist dictatorship? What sort of civil discourse was she referring to?
So the civil discourse that I'm referring to that she engages in is discourse with her friends. So her friends, other social democrats, and her get together and they just talk about the Reichstag fire, for example, and they talk about how they think the Nazis started the Reichstag fire. So this is something that the Social Democrats are very much going to propagate, this idea. And again, it's debated as to who started this fire, but they're very much going to say it's the Nazis who started it, or they're going to talk about these new concentration camps. Like she knows all about what's going on in Oranienburg, and she doesn't know totally about everything that's going on in Oranienburg until she reads her husband's book. But she knows about the fact that it's open. She knows about the fact that Rosslau is open. They talk about people being transferred there. So these kinds of things they're talking openly about in their households. So I think this is something that I mean when I say engaging in civil discourse, the idea that it's okay to kind of continue talking about these things in your home, in your office space. I talk about these things every day with my colleagues in the history department at Longwood University.
Thank you. This is sort of a general one. Someone asked, it amazes me how many people don't know much about World War II. Do you find in teaching this, there are many that are not aware of the history?
So I think that what we're seeing is this is ancient history to especially the students who I teach. I'm currently teaching Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And a lot of them see this as ancient history, right? 80 years ago, it's just ancient history. If it didn't happen yesterday or last, 2 hours ago, it's ancient history, though. This is a generation that, of course, is very much has a short attention span. So the idea of the Holocaust, of course, lots of people don't knowing all the facts about the Holocaust. And then, of course, with internet culture spreading Holocaust denial, spreading it under the guise of legitimate academic kind of institutions and what they claim are legitimate academic institutions or academic sounding journals. This also doesn't help in any way, of course. But I do think it is amazing that it took an entire generation, especially in Germany, for people to start talking about World War II and the Holocaust. It took until kind of the 1960s, the children of people who were born, of people who lived during World War II. And in America, we really started talking about the Holocaust. It became part of our education in the 1970s, late 1970s. This is when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum kind of council started. They came up with the idea for the museum, which of course didn't open until the 90s. But I do think it took a generation for us to kind of recognize it, talk about it. We did a pretty good job. And now there's, of course, the last kind of decade and a half, where you do have more and more people being surprised when they hear things like 6 million Jews were killed, 6 million others were killed. Because again, I think of this internet culture, and also because of people, especially students, seeing it as ancient history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can you talk about what was happening around the media during this lead up to the Nazis' complete takeover? Was the media complicit with the Nazis?
Sure, that's a great question. So I will say that the media is reporting on things that are going on. So it does report on the sporadic murder or kidnapping, so to say, of Jews. This is also something that is reported on in the United States media. So the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, started a project back in 2015, 2016, called the History Unfolded Project. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but this was a crowdsourcing project to actually go into newspapers, local newspapers, regional newspapers, national newspapers, all here in the United States, and to see what the media was reporting on. And the project has now been majorly influential for a new exhibit at the museum, a special exhibit, a traveling exhibit called Americans and the Holocaust. Americans and the Holocaust became influential for the Ken Burns documentary that came out about 2 years ago called Americans and the Holocaust. And the overwhelming evidence from these newspapers, the crowdsourcing project, shows that US newspapers were very much reporting on things going on. So not necessarily complicit here in the US, but things in Germany is that you do have newspapers reporting on things. Again, sporadic murder, and you have things like Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in which Jewish synagogues are smashed, windows are smashed and burned to the ground in Jewish businesses. This is appearing on the front page of newspapers, again, in Germany and also here in the United States and around the world. So we do know about these things. Not everything is always appearing on the front page. Sometimes it's buried in newspapers. So I hope that answered the question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. We have maybe 3 or 4 more questions. How long were concentration camps used in Germany, or prison camps, for political prisoners before they came to be sort of the mass murder camps that we've heard about?
So there is a difference between concentration camps and death camps. So the death camps are also known as extermination camps. Those are the ones where the majority of Jews are the majority of people murdered in those camps. Those 6 camps, there are 6 of these camps, they all open in 1941 or 1942. And none of them existed in Germany. All 6 of them existed in Poland. I will say that in Germany, there are concentration camps that are opened as early as 1933. The majority of prisoners who are in concentration camps between 1933 until 1938 are political prisoners. There are some Jews in concentration camps. There are some Roma Sinti in concentration camps, but it's not until after Kristallnacht that you have kind of the first mass roundup of Jews being sent to concentration camps in Germany. But there is a difference between the concentration camps that exist in Germany, but not only in Germany. They exist in Austria, they exist in France. I saw one in Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia last summer, Trieste, Italy. So there's concentration camps all over the place, but the death camps where you have mass murder taking place, Jews being gassed with Zyklon B, Jews and others being gassed with Zyklon B in what are supposed, what are disguised as showers, and their bodies being burned in crematoria. That is happening in these death camps in Poland. And those are only open in 1941, starting in the fall of 1941 or 1942. And these camps are different because they never have a growing population of people. Jews are sent there, other victims are sent there solely to be killed.
I didn't know that. Let me see. Sorry, one second.
No problem.
So there's a few questions about your process. Actually, one more about the history. Can you talk about the state of the judiciary in Germany in the late 30s?
In the early 30s?
It says late 30s. I think that just the judicial system.
The judicial system?
Yeah.
So there is in April through kind of the summer of 1933, after Hitler is chancellor, something that I did not mention in this lecture is a few weeks after the Reichstag fire and that last election in Germany, Hitler passes a very important law through the Reichstag known as the Enabling Act. He's able to pass this law through the Reichstag because of the fact that so many of the Social Democrats and communists were arrested as a result of the Reichstag fire decree. So Gerhart Seger, for example, is a member of the Reichstag and can't vote against this law. There were 94 Social Democrats who voted against this, but this became a law. And this law allowed Hitler to rule by decree. It allows him to become a dictator. This is the very important law that allows him to have power in Germany. And after that, there is a coordination, if you will, of all branches, state governments, the judicial branch, that everything is Nazified within Germany. And this largely takes place, again, between kind of April of 1933 through the summer of 1933. So this is when the judicial branch very much becomes Nazified. State governments, Nazis are put in charge of state governments. The offices of the Social Democrats are raided, and all political parties are outlawed by July of 1933. This is especially when the press, a lot of the freedom of the press was kind of lost with the Reichstag fire decree, but the press is essentially Nazified after this point. But again, it happens very quickly early on.
Thank you. So some questions about your process and relationship with the family.
Sure.
One person is asking about, she says, thank you for sharing how you stored the archives and accessed them. How did you end up handling the ethical questions of keeping someone else's documents at your home? Do you have any insights?
So it is a work in progress. I spent some time with Jennifer 2 weeks ago, talking to her about how I think it's very important for her family to donate these materials to a museum. I've suggested the Virginia Holocaust Museum, which to me seems like a logical place. This is where, of course, our relationship started through the Virginia Holocaust Museum. It's here in Richmond where I live. I know the director of archives and collections at the museum, so I've also, tried to put them in touch with them. I just think it's a matter of the family kind of taking the initiative to do it. But yeah, the questions remain. I do think this is very important to kind of think about. I do think I have a good relationship with the family. They are very happy that their grandmother's memoir is out in the world. It's just about kind of getting them to take initiative. Half the archive is in my house, but more of the archive is in the oldest grandson's house, Mark's house, because his parents have recently died and he's acquired all of these materials in Terre Haute, Indiana. And I just don't think it's kind of a top priority. And I do have kind of ethical questions about, we never really signed a contract as to like when I should give these materials back. I do think I should give these materials back. They're not my materials. What happens when the grandchildren die? This is also something I've thought about, and I sort of brought up with Jennifer again a couple weeks ago. Like, this is important to kind of figure these things out before anything happens to any of these grandchildren.
So that leads to another question. How did you meet and build trust with the family? And related, did they know what they had on their hands?
Actually, when I was showing Jennifer and telling her about some of the things a couple weeks ago in her parents' retirement community, she did not know what they had. I was telling her about the fact that they have, for example, with a Reichstag like Tagebuch, they basically have a list of all the Reichstag members and their political parties in the cities they represent from 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933. These things in their possession, which I think, again, are very important things. I told her also about a series of letters that I have between her grandparents. So between Ilse and Gerhart. Ilse's living in Switzerland, Gerhardt's traveling through the United States. These are all handwritten letters, and she had no idea that these were in the collection. So, she told me that she knew about some stuff and she took some of the stuff, in fact, when her grandmother died. I think her oldest brother, Mark, might have a little bit better of an idea of what's in the collection because he's closer to the collection. He's living there. They have a ton of photographs. There's a ton of photographs in the book. Some of these that I'm showing you here that are personal family photos. So he might have a better idea of some of the things in the collection, but it can be a very rich personal collection. And, there's probably hundreds of these collections that exist that we just don't always have our hands on. And in terms of building trust, I think that I stuck around. This was a time in which I read the story and I thought, this is interesting. I had no idea how timely it would be, but I thought, this is interesting. This is a story people are going to want to hear. And I stuck around. I kept emailing, even when they wouldn't respond. And I think that helped build some of the trust. And I wasn't also saying anything bad about their grandma. There's nothing bad to say about her.
One more question. Are there other memoirs that are similar or tell same parts of this? Like, is this new on the scene, or what are we learning that's new here?
Sure, that's a great question. So I do think that in terms of having a memoir of the wife of a political opponent, especially someone who's in an early concentration camp, that's pretty unique. So there are other women who are wives of communists and social democrats who are in concentration camps. They're also imprisoned. I don't know of any of them who have written a memoir. I do know of other political opponents. There's an example of Tony Sender, for example, who is a political opponent who is living in exile, who writes a kind of fragmentary diary. So she's also kind of witnessing the transition between democracy to dictatorship, which is also something that I think is very unique. So I think Ilse's memoir, it's exceptional in those regards. The wife of a political opponent who's in the Reichstag. So she's giving us a lens as to his life, what's going on with him, his campaigning, but also she's talking about her own experiences and how she, becomes a resistor of sorts and how she has to deal with being a single mom while her husband's in this camp and while he's in exile. I do think that her story she definitely has more of a pulse on the political scene in Germany because of the fact that her husband is in politics, right? If another woman wrote a memoir whose husband wasn't necessarily in politics, we might not get, everything kind of politically that was going on in Germany. People might not have been paying attention as much, in other words.
Yeah. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a couple comments about where to buy the book. So I think they can use this QR code, or I will send out links.
Yeah, you can use this QR code. This has an ebook version too, because I know some people like to use the ebook version. You can buy that. The press is Indiana University Press. I, of course, recommend buying it from the press. So I hope that you will purchase it and enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great night.